The temperature inside the fuselage of the consolidated B-24 Liberator, named Lil de-Icer, was precisely 118 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 o'clock in the morning on August 1st, 1943. Sergeant Robert Bobby Vance, a 20-year-old assistant flight engineer who had spent his youth on a dairy farm in Ohio, wiped a mixture of grease and sweat from his forehead with the back of a hand that was already stained black by high-octane aviation gasoline. He was kneeling on the narrow 9-inch catwalk that ran the length of the bomber's bomb bay, staring at a series of thick rubber hoses that snaked around two massive, rectangular metal boxes. These were not bombs. They were auxiliary fuel tanks, each carrying 400 gallons of highly volatile fuel, and they had been bolted directly into the racks where the 2,000-pound blockbusters usually hung. Bobby could hear the fuel sloshing inside the metal skins with every slight vibration of the airframe, a sound that reminded him of a dark, hidden tide. The air in the bomb bay was so thick with gasoline fumes that his eyes stung, and he knew that a single static spark from his wool flight suit would turn the 32-ton aircraft into a vertical column of fire before the engines even turned over. He checked the brass nuts on the manifold one more time, his fingers feeling the jagged edges of the metal. The B-24 Liberator was a masterpiece of 1930s engineering, but it was never designed for the extreme demands of Operation Tidal Wave. To reach the Romanian oil refineries at Ploiesti from the parched desert airfields of Benghazi, Libya, the aircraft had to fly 2,400 miles round trip. The standard fuel capacity of a Liberator was 2,364 gallons, which gave it a safe combat radius of approximately 1,000 miles. Ploiesti was 1,200 miles away. The math was simple and lethal for everyone involved. If they flew with standard tanks, the 177 bombers would run out of fuel somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea on the return leg, falling into the water long before they reached the African coast. The mission was a gamble, on a scale that few in the American High Command were comfortable with. Every man on the field knew the stakes were their lives versus Hitler's oil. The solution was a crude but brilliant mechanical hack that the ground crews had been frantically executing for the past 3 weeks. Engineers had ordered the installation of these extra Tokyo tanks in the forward bomb bay, connecting them to the main fuel system with hand-operated valves and temporary rubber lines. This modification increased the total fuel load to over 3,100 gallons. However, it also shifted the center of gravity of the aircraft forward by 4 inches and increased the takeoff weight to a staggering 64,000 pounds. This was 4,000 pounds over the absolute maximum design limit specified by the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation in San Diego. Bobby Vance checked the brass fittings on the number 3 fuel line for the 8th time since he had entered the fuselage. He knew that the vibrations from the 4 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engines would rattle every one of these hand-tightened connections for the next 14 hours. He could feel the tension in the metal beneath his boots as if the plane itself was screaming. "Vance, stop petting the tanks and get to your station," shouted the pilot, First Lieutenant John Palm, his voice muffled by the noise of nearby engines. Bobby scrambled back through the narrow hatch into the waist section of the plane, nearly tripping over a belt of .50 caliber ammunition. He could feel the weight of the aircraft in his knees as it groaned on its struts. The B-24 felt like a lead weight resting on 4 thin pillars of air, a massive beast struggling against the desert heat. Outside, the Libyan desert was a blinding white expanse of sand and heat haze that shimmered like a broken mirror. Bobby watched through the waist window as the ground crews in their shorts and undershirts pulled away, the wooden wheel chocks. The desert wind blew fine silica dust into the open windows, coating everything in a layer of grit. The 177 bombers were lined up in 5 distinct groups, their engines idling and throwing up clouds of fine silica dust that ground away at the steel cylinder walls of the radial engines. The noise was a low-frequency rumble that vibrated the bones in Bobby's chest. The mission was called Operation Tidal Wave for its intended impact. It was a gamble of historic proportions that aimed at the very heart of the German war machine. If they succeeded, they would destroy 35% of Adolf Hitler's high-octane fuel supply in a single morning, potentially shortening the war by months. If they failed, the United States Army Air Forces would lose nearly 2,000 of its most experienced airmen and a significant portion of its long-range bomber fleet in the Mediterranean theater. Bobby gripped his seat harness as the first bomber in the line began to move. At precisely 0707 hours, the first B-24, a lead ship named Wongo Wongo, began its takeoff roll down the sun-baked runway. Bobby watched through the waist window as the massive bomber struggled to gain speed on the sand-covered runway, its tail wheel kicking up a rooster tail of dust. The aircraft needed 2,800 feet to lift off at normal mission weight, but today, every pilot was praying that 4,500 feet of sand and gravel would be enough to get them airborne. The tires, inflated to 65 pounds per square inch to handle the excess load, groaned under the pressure of the 64,000-pound beast. Halfway down the runway, Wongo Wongo hit a patch of soft sand, its nose wheel wobbling violently and threatening to collapse the entire front gear. The pilot pulled the nose up at 115 miles per hour, the wings bending dangerously as they caught the air. The bomber cleared the trees at the end of the field by less than 10 feet, its shadow flickering over the rocks. Bobby felt the Lil de-icer begin to move as Palm pushed the throttles forward. The vibration was different today. It was a deep, structural resonance that shook the ammunition boxes in their mounts and made the cockpit glass rattle in its frames. The 4 throttles were pushed forward until the manifold pressure gauges read 48 inches. The noise was no longer a sound. It was a physical wall of pressure that pressed against Bobby's chest and made his teeth ache. For 40 seconds, the runway blurred past the windows, a gray streak of stone and dust that seemed to have no end. At 105 miles per hour, they were still on the ground, the tires screaming against the heat. At 110 miles per hour, they were running out of dirt. Palm pulled back on the yoke with both hands, his knuckles white, using every ounce of his strength to overcome the forward heavy balance of the extra fuel tanks. The aircraft groaned as if the aluminum skin was under a giant's thumb. The Davis wing, a high aspect ratio design that made the B-24 the fastest bomber in the world, finally found enough lift to break the suction of the desert runway. They were airborne at 122 miles per hour, just as the flat sand gave way to a rocky drop-off. Bobby held his breath as they crossed the shoreline at an altitude of only 50 feet, the spray from the waves hitting the belly of the plane. Below them, the Mediterranean was a deep, indifferent blue that stretched to the horizon. 176 other bombers were following them, forming a massive, slow-moving armada of wood, steel, and 3 million gallons of explosive gasoline. They were flying in a tight formation, the wingtips of the neighboring planes just 20 feet away. 2 hours into the flight, the first major disaster struck the formation. Wongo Wongo, the lead navigator's aircraft that held the precise coordinates for the entire group, suddenly dipped its left wing toward the water. Without warning, the bomber rolled 90 degrees and plummeted toward the sea. Bobby watched from his window, his mouth dry and his heart hammering against his ribs as the lead ship hit the ocean at 210 miles per hour. There was no fire, only a white geyser of water and a debris field of aluminum that disappeared in seconds. 10 men were gone in an instant. The lead navigator was gone, taking the mission's primary brain with him. Bobby stared at the empty patch of water where a 30-ton bomber had been seconds before. The formation began to fragment almost immediately after the lead ship went down. Without the central navigator, the remaining 176 bombers were forced to rely on their individual navigators to find a pinpoint target 800 miles away in a foreign land. The plan required them to maintain strict radio silence to avoid alerting the German radar stations, which meant no one could ask for a bearing or a correction. They were flying at 10,000 feet, crossing the Albanian mountains as the morning sun climbed higher. But the weather, ever unpredictable, was closing in with a vengeance. A thick bank of cumulus clouds rose to 20,000 feet like an impenetrable white wall, forcing the 5 different groups to separate to avoid mid-air collisions in the blind mist. Bobby Vance looked back into the bomb bay as the plane shook in the turbulence of the clouds. A faint mist was beginning to form around the seal of the auxiliary tank nearest to the No. 3 engine. It was a leak. A small rhythmic drip of gasoline was hitting the catwalk once every 2 seconds, each drop disappearing into the dark recesses below. He knew that the cabin heaters were located just 6 feet behind the bomb bay doors. If the gasoline vapor reached the heating elements, the Lil de-icer would become the second bomber to disappear into the sea before they even saw the smoke of Ploiesti. He reached for his wrench with a shaking hand, knowing that if he turned the bolt too hard, the brass might snap. But if he did nothing, the mission was over for them. He tightened the fitting by a quarter turn, praying the seal would hold. The mountains of Romania finally appeared on the horizon at 11:15 hours. The bombers began their long descent, dropping from 10,000 feet down toward the green carpet of the forest floor. The plan was to attack at an altitude of only 30 meters, a height that seemed suicidal for a 4-engine bomber. This was the final mechanical trick of the mission. By flying lower than the height of the refinery chimneys, they would be underneath the radar and too low for the heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns to aim their barrels. But as the Liberators leveled out at 100 feet above the trees, Bobby saw something that wasn't in the intelligence briefing he had read back in Benghazi. The ground below them wasn't deserted. The ground was moving with life. Thousands of German and Romanian gunners were already at their stations, alerted by the fragmentation of the formation. The sky was beginning to fill with the black puffs of flak that looked like small, deadly flowers. Bobby could see the flashes of light from the machine gun nests in the hills. He knew they were flying into a trap. The smell of the gasoline in the bomb bay seemed even stronger now as the plane banked hard to the left. He gripped the handles of his waist gun, his thumbs resting on the triggers. They were approaching the first of the refineries, a massive complex of steel pipes and silver tanks. The heat from the desert had been replaced by the heat of the engines and the tension of the crew. Bobby looked at the watch on his wrist, the second hand ticking toward the start of the attack. He could hear the flak hitting the aluminum skin of the plane, a sound like gravel hitting a tin roof. He screamed a warning to the pilot as a bridge appeared directly ahead. Palm pulled up at the last second, the belly of the bomber clearing the stone arches by less than 5 feet. The mission was no longer a planned raid. It was a desperate scramble for survival. The clouds had delayed them by 30 minutes, and the German radar had tracked them for the last 100 miles. As they began their final run toward the Astra Romana refinery, Bobby saw the first of the refineries erupt in flames from the bombs of the group ahead of them. The air was filled with black smoke that smelled of sulfur and burning oil. He looked at the fuel tanks in the bomb bay again. They were still 3/4 full. He knew that any piece of shrapnel that hit those tanks would turn the plane into a fireball. Bobby tightened his grip on the .50 caliber machine gun as the first German tracers flew past his window. He could see the individual gunner on the ground, a man in a gray uniform who was screaming as he fired a belt of ammunition. The distance was so small that Bobby could see the man's goggles. He fired back, the recoil of the twin 50s shaking his entire body. The noise was overwhelming, a symphony of destruction that roared in his ears. They were 30 feet off the ground and moving at 300 feet per second. There was no room for error and no time for fear. As the Lil de-icer roared over the perimeter fence of the refinery, Bobby saw the giant boiler houses looming ahead. The smoke was so thick he could barely see the wingtips. He felt the plane lurch as the bombardier opened the doors. The gasoline fumes in the bomb bay were whipped around by the 300-mile-per-hour wind. It was the most dangerous moment of his life. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second and prayed to the god of the dairy farms that he would see another sunrise. The first explosions from the fuel tanks on the ground sent a shockwave that nearly flipped the bomber. Bobby grabbed the window frame to keep from being thrown across the cabin. The light from the fires was brighter than the sun. He could see the silhouettes of the other bombers in the smoke, flying through the flames like ghosts. The mission had reached its climax, and the sky over Ploiesti was burning with the lives of 1,000 men. Bobby Vance screamed into the intercom as a line of anti-aircraft guns on a rooftop began tracking them. The tracers were walking toward the cockpit. He watched as the glass shattered and the plane began to shudder with a series of heavy hits. They were in the heart of the furnace now. At precisely 14:45 hours, the lead aircraft of the second formation, belonging to the 389th Bomb Group, made a fatal navigational error that would turn the Operation Tidal Wave into a coordinated slaughterhouse. They turned 30 degrees to the south at the small town of Târgoviște, mistaking the local landmark for the planned turning point at Ploiești. This single error in judgment sent 50 heavily laden bombers flying directly toward the heart of Bucharest, the most heavily defended city in all of Eastern Europe, instead of their assigned oil refineries. By the time the formation commanders realized the mistake and swung the massive planes back toward the north, the element of surprise had been utterly annihilated. The German commander of the defenses, General Alfred Gerstenberg, a man known for his pathological attention to detail, had already activated every one of the 237 heavy anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of light 20mm autocannons that ringed the vital oil fields. Bobby Vance felt the Lille de-icer dip its nose in a sudden, violent motion, and the altimeter in the waist section began to spin counterclockwise with terrifying speed. They were dropping from 5,000 feet straight down to a target altitude of only 30 meters. The sensation of flying a 64,000-pound bomber at 210 miles per hour, just 30 feet above the rolling Romanian countryside, was unlike anything Bobby had ever experienced in his training. The ground was no longer a distant map of green and brown. It was a blur of high-speed obstacles that seemed to be rushing toward them with the force of a train. Through the waist window, he could see the individual ears of corn in the fields being flattened by the enormous pressure wave generated by the 4 Hamilton Standard propellers. The vibration was so intense that the rivets in the aluminum skin were buzzing like a hive of angry hornets, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the skull. Looking ahead, he saw the skyline of Ploiesti appearing through the summer haze. It wasn't just a city. It was a Gothic forest of 300-foot-tall refinery chimneys, each one spewing thick, oily smoke that rose into the clear blue sky like funeral pyres. He gripped his machine gun, his heart drumming a rhythm that was faster than the engines. Guns ready. Watch the tree lines and the rooftops. Palm's voice crackled over the intercom with an edge of adrenaline that Bobby hadn't heard before. Bobby grabbed the cold steel handles of the twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns in the left waist window, his thumbs resting on the butterfly triggers. He didn't have to look for targets because the targets were everywhere he turned his head. German gunners were hidden in haystacks, in church steeples, and on the camouflaged roofs of nearby farmhouses. The air was filled with a crisscross pattern of green and white tracers that seemed to be coming from every horizontal and vertical direction at once. The B-24 was so low that Bobby was actually looking down into the eyes of the German soldiers in their trenches as they passed at 300 feet per second. He squeezed the triggers, the 200 rounds per minute vibrations of the guns adding to the mechanical chaos inside the cabin. The smell of burnt cordite filled the fuselage, mixing with the ever-present, suffocating stench of 100-octane gasoline from the leaky bomb bay tanks. As they crossed the railway line 3 miles from the massive Astra Romana refinery, Bobby saw a nightmare in motion that made his blood turn to ice. A long freight train was moving parallel to the bombers on a raised embankment, but it wasn't carrying coal or industrial machinery. The sides of the seemingly innocent boxcars suddenly fell away on heavy hinges, revealing hidden 37mm flak guns and quadruple 20mm cannons that were already manned and aiming. This was General Gerstenberg's secret tactical weapon: flak trains that could travel to any point in the refinery complex at 50 miles per hour to intercept the low-level raiders. The German gunners began firing at point-blank range, their shells screaming past the waist window. Bobby watched in horror as the B-24 flying just 50 yards to their left, a ship named the Witch, was hit squarely in the cockpit by a 37mm explosive shell. The aircraft flared up like a torch for a split second. Then its nose dug into the dirt at 200 miles per hour. It cartwheeled in a massive explosion of aluminum and burning fuel that sent a shockwave through the Lille deicer, throwing Bobby against the bulkhead. They were now inside the heart of the refinery complex, and the heat was staggering beyond belief. The bombers in the first wave had already dropped their 500-pound incendiaries, and the massive oil storage tanks were erupting in volcanoes of orange fire and black smoke. The temperature outside the plexiglass windows jumped from 85 degrees to an estimated 130 degrees in a matter of seconds. Bobby could feel the paint on the interior of the fuselage beginning to blister and smell like acrid chemicals. The B-24 was flying through a literal furnace of Hitler's making. The black smoke was so thick and oily that the pilots were essentially flying by instinct and memory, dodging stone chimneys that appeared out of the murk at 400 feet per second. The aircraft was buffeted by thermal updrafts that were more powerful than any storm Bobby had ever seen. The heat from the fires below hitting the wings like a physical hammer and forcing the plane upward against the pilot's will. A sudden violent jolt that sounded like a thunderclap threw Bobby across the ammunition racks. A 20mm shell had punched through the right waist section, passing just 6 inches from his head, and exploded in the radio compartment with a brilliant flash of blue light. He heard a high-pitched scream over the intercom, followed by a burst of static that signaled the end of the communication system. The B-24 shuddered and began to yaw dangerously to the right. The number 4 engine, located on the far right of the wing, was beginning to trail a 20-foot plume of thick white smoke and spraying oil. The oil pressure gauge on the flight deck was dropping towards zero with a terrifying finality. Bobby knew that if the engine seized suddenly, the torque would pull the 30-ton aircraft into a roll, and at 30 feet of altitude, there was no room for recovery and no time for a parachute. "Vance, get the fire extinguisher to the radio room and check for casualties," Palm's voice shouted through the remaining intercom line. Bobby unhooked his oxygen mask. They were so low that the air was thick and breathable, though it tasted of sulfur, and grabbed the heavy red carbon dioxide bottle from its mount. The radio room was a jagged mess of shredded metal, broken vacuum tubes, and burning insulation that filled the small space with toxic fumes. The radio operator, a soft-spoken kid from Maine who had joined the crew just 2 weeks ago, was slumped over his desk, his flight suit soaked in dark blood. Bobby didn't think. He just sprayed the CO2 onto the flames, the white fog temporarily obscuring the carnage and cooling the metal. Every few seconds, the aircraft would buck wildly as it flew through the thermal updrafts created by the burning oil below. The turbulence was so severe that it was literally lifting the 32-ton bomber and dropping it 20 feet at a time, making it feel like a toy in a giant's hand. They finally reached their primary target, the massive boiler house of the Astra Romana refinery, a structure that provided the power for the entire complex. The bomb bay doors creaked open with a heavy mechanical groan, the wind howling through the metal cage at 300 miles per hour. This was the moment of maximum danger for the entire crew. The Tokyo tanks were still half full of fuel, and the bomb bay was an open cavern filled with explosive gasoline vapor that could be ignited by the smallest spark. One stray tracer bullet through the open doors would end them all in a millisecond. Bobby watched from the hatch as the bombardier, peering through a specialized low-level sight, released a stick of 3 500-pound bombs with specialized delayed-action fuses. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,500 pounds of dead weight left the racks and fell into the smoke below. As they pulled away from the target area, Bobby looked back through the waist window and saw a hellscape that defied description. The refinery was a solid wall of fire and debris. 5 bombers from their immediate group were already down, their wrecks burning in the middle of the factory floor. One Liberator, the Sandman, was flying at 10 feet above the ground, its entire tail section on fire like a comet, the tail gunner still firing his weapons until the very moment the plane hit a storage tank. The plane disappeared in a ball of fire that rose 500 feet into the air, a sight that Bobby would see in his dreams for years to come. The mission was no longer an attack. It was a desperate, primal struggle to find clean air and a way out of the black smoke that was choking the engines. Palm pushed the 3 remaining throttles to the firewall, the engines screaming in protest as they struggled to maintain speed. They were heading for the open fields north of the city, hoping to find a gap in the defenses. But a line of 90-foot-tall high-tension power lines appeared directly in their flight path, stretching across the horizon like a trap. The Lil de-icer was too heavy and too slow on 3 engines to climb over them in the short distance available. Palm made a split-second decision that made Bobby's heart stop. He dipped the nose even lower. The ground was so close that Bobby could see the individual stones in the fields. Bobby watched in absolute horror as the aircraft flew directly under the high-tension power lines. The vertical stabilizer cleared the wires by less than 3 feet, the electrical arc from the cables jumping to the metal tail and sending a blue flash through the entire fuselage that made Bobby's hair stand on end. The shock of the near miss left everyone on the plane silent for several long seconds, the only sound being the roar of the engines. But as they cleared the wires and leveled out, Bobby looked at the right wing and saw that their luck had run out. The number 4 engine wasn't just smoking white anymore. A jagged orange flame was licking out from the cowling and spreading toward the fuel tanks. The aluminum skin of the wing was starting to glow a dull, dangerous red that signaled imminent structural failure. The sky behind them was a solid wall of black smoke that covered 15 square miles and could be seen from 60 miles away. Behind that wall lay the wrecks of 53 Liberators and the bodies of over 400 of Bobby's friends. The Lil de-icer was out of the fire for now, but it was 300 miles from the nearest emergency landing strip in the Mediterranean, and the fire in the wing was growing by the minute. Bobby looked at the fire extinguisher, but it was empty. He looked at the fuel gauges, then at the engine. The fire was eating through the magnesium mount, and he knew that the engine could fall off the wing at any moment. He gripped the survival kit in his vest, wondering if he would ever see the green hills of Ohio again. As they crossed the first ridge of the mountains on the way back, Bobby saw another B-24 flying just 100 yards away. Its nose was gone, and the pilots were sitting in an open cockpit, their goggles covered in oil and blood. The 2 planes flew in a silent, broken formation for several miles, a testament to the durability of the Liberator and the stubbornness of the men inside. But then the other plane's wing simply folded upward. Bobby watched it fall toward the forest below without a sound, a silent death in the Romanian wilderness. He was the only one left in the waist section who was still standing. He looked at the radio operator, who was still alive but barely breathing, and he knew that the real struggle was only just beginning. The sun was starting to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape. The fire in the engine nacelle had reached the fuel lines, and a steady stream of fire was trailing behind them like a banner. Palm was yelling for someone to check the fuel transfer valves, but the controls were jammed by shrapnel. Bobby began to clear away the debris with his bare hands, the hot metal burning his skin. He didn't feel the pain, only the desperate need to keep the plane in the air. They were now over the open sea, the coast of Romania disappearing into the haze. The Mediterranean looked like a dark, cold grave. Bobby sat on the floor, watching the fire and the darkening sky. He counted the seconds between the vibrations of the engines, waiting for the one that would signify the end. The raid was over, but the price was still being paid in every mile of the flight home. The fire in the No. 4 engine cowl of the WWII finally starved itself of oxygen at 16:22 hours, leaving only a blackened, twisted radial engine and a frozen propeller that stood vertically like a jagged tombstone. Sergeant Bobby Vance stood in the middle of the waist section, his hands trembling with an uncontrollable vibration as he looked at the red-hot magnesium engine mounts through the gaps in the shredded aluminum skin. They were 300 feet above the jagged Balkan mountains, flying at only 155 miles per hour. This was 20 miles per hour below the safe cruising speed for a Liberator, but it was the absolute maximum they could manage with 3 engines and a fuselage that was now more air than metal. The aircraft was vibrating with a new, low-frequency shudder that felt like the main wing spar was slowly fracturing. Bobby looked at the fuel gauges. The auxiliary Tokyo tanks were empty, and the main wing tanks were showing less than 320 gallons of fuel left for a 500-mile journey. They were 540 miles from Benghazi. Every piece of torn aluminum and every frozen propeller blade was acting like a parachute, slowing them down and forcing the remaining 3 engines to burn fuel at a suicidal rate of 190 gallons per hour. Bobby didn't need a slide rule to know they were going to fall into the Mediterranean, long before they saw the coast of Africa. He looked at Lieutenant Palm, who was wrestling with the yoke to keep the heavy bomber from sliding into a permanent, fatal right-hand turn toward the sea. The pilot's face was a mask of sweat and oil, his teeth gritted against the physical strain of the controls. "Throw it all out," Palm ordered over the crackling intercom. Everything that isn't bolted to the floor. Now. Bobby and the surviving waist gunner began a frantic, desperate ritual of weight reduction. They unbolted the 4.50 caliber machine guns, each weighing 64 pounds, and shoved them through the open waist windows into the blue void below. They kicked out the ammunition boxes, 3,000 rounds of heavy steel-jacketed lead, followed by the thousands of spent brass casings that covered the floor like golden carpet. They threw out the armored plating, the heavy radio equipment, their own survival kits, and even the oxygen bottles. In 10 minutes, they had jettisoned over 1,400 pounds of weight, and the WWII responded by climbing 10 feet higher. As they crossed the coastline of Albania, Bobby looked at the formation around them. On the way to Ploiesti, there had been 177 bombers. Now he could only see 11 other aircraft, scattered like broken toys. Some were flying with 2 engines feathered. Others were so low their hulls were almost touching the waves. One B-24, named the Blue Guardian, was flying so low its propeller wash was creating twin trails of white spray on the water. A desperate attempt to stay in the air. Bobby watched it for 5 silent minutes until the aircraft suddenly stalled and disintegrated instantly into a white patch of foam. There were no parachutes. The medical emergency in the radio room was reaching a crisis point. The radio operator was moaning in his sleep, his leg mangled by the 20mm shell from the attack. Bobby used a belt as a crude tourniquet, pulling it tight until the bleeding slowed to a drip. But he knew the boy was in shock. He had no morphine left. The medical kit had been thrown out to save weight. He sat on the floor, holding the boy's hand and whispering things he didn't even remember saying, trying to provide comfort in a cabin that was freezing as the sun began to set. The wind howling through the shell holes was a constant, mocking reminder of their vulnerability. The final official tally of Operation Tidal Wave would be the most shocking number in the history of American strategic bombing. Out of the 177 bombers that had taken off with such hope that morning, 53 did not return to their bases. That was a 30% loss rate in a single mission, a number that was considered unsustainable by any military standard. In the 9th Bomber Command, the loss of 53 aircraft in one day was more than they had lost in the previous 4 months of active combat combined. But the numbers grew darker when the human cost was calculated. 440 airmen were killed in action, 54 more were severely wounded, and 79 were captured and taken to prisoner-of-war camps in Romania. Bobby Vance sat on the floor, holding a blood-stained bandage against the radio operator's leg with his remaining strength. The kid's breathing was shallow and ragged, a sound Bobby could hear even over the roar of the engines. He looked out the window at the setting sun, wondering if the smoke over the refineries was worth the 440 lives extinguished in less than 30 minutes. Intelligence reports would later claim they had destroyed 40% of the refinery capacity at Ploiesti. But the reality discovered after the war was different. Within 90 days, the Germans had used slave laborers to repair the damage, and oil production actually increased to levels higher than before the raid. The most dangerous and expensive mission in history had been a catastrophic strategic failure. At 1930 hours, the Lil de-Icer's No. 2 engine finally coughed and seized with a violent jolt. They were now flying on only 2 engines, both pushed far beyond their limits. Bobby felt the aircraft drop toward the water like a lead weight, the altimeter winding down through 500, 400, 300 feet. The desert floor of North Africa was a black void beneath them. Palm didn't have enough power to reach the main runway at Benghazi, which was still 10 miles away. He aimed the nose toward a flat stretch of sand 3 miles from the airfield, hoping for the best in the darkness. "Brace for impact," Bobby shouted. He grabbed the radio operator and pulled him away from the jagged radio desk, curling his own body around the boy as a human shield. He thought of the dairy farm in Ohio, the smell of fresh hay, and his mother's voice calling him for dinner. He could feel the air rushing past the shell holes as the B-24 hit the sand at 110 miles per hour, with the gear retracted. The sound was a deafening metallic screech of tortured aluminum. The aircraft skidded across the desert for 600 feet, its belly plates tearing away and filling the fuselage with a blinding cloud of sand. When the motion finally stopped, there was a deathly silence. Bobby opened his eyes and coughed up the gray dust coating his throat. He was still alive, and the radio operator was still breathing, though his pulse was faint. He looked through the broken top hatch at the cold stars. He climbed out of the wreck, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. The desert air was cool, a sharp contrast to the furnace he had been in during the raid. He looked back at the Lil de-Icer, now a broken shell of aluminum lying in the sand. Out of the 10 men who had taken off that morning, 7 were still alive to see the moon rise. They stood around the smoking wreck, breathing in the smell of the desert and the faint scent of 100-octane gasoline that would always be the smell of their youth. Bobby Vance found a small, jagged piece of plexiglass in his pocket that had blown out of the cockpit. He held it up to the starlight. A tiny, transparent fragment of the most expensive and lethal morning in the history of the world. A mission that had promised to end the war, but had only ended the lives of hundreds of his friends. He didn't feel like a hero. He only felt tired beyond words. He sat down on the sand and waited for the rescue trucks, the silence of the desert finally drowning out the roar of the engines. Operation Tidal Wave was over. A display of unparalleled bravery that cost far too much. For the men who stood in the sand that night, it was the moment they realized that the price of war was always paid in human flesh. Bobby closed his eyes and let the fragment of plexiglass fall into the sand, where it would be buried by the wind. He would never fly a bomber again, and he would never speak of Ploiesti for the rest of his life. He just wanted to go home to Ohio and forget the smell of burning oil. The fire in the refineries would burn for 3 months, a black stain on the Romanian landscape. No, for the 177 bombers and the men who flew them, the fire had already burned out. They were survivors of a flight that had taken them to the edge of the world and back. As the first searchlights of the airfield appeared, Bobby took one last look at the Lil de-icer and walked away, without looking back into the darkness.